Most murder cases end the same way: someone commits the crime, someone pays the price. But this story never fit that simple pattern. Two teenagers carried out the same brutal spree on the same night, for the same motive, and left the same trail of devastation behind them. Yet only one of them was sentenced to die. The other, who pulled the trigger just as many times, was allowed to live, sitting in a Texas prison with a parole date decades down the road. For years, people have asked the same question: how does a justice system look at two killers standing side by side and decide one deserves a needle while the other deserves a second chance? The answer isn't clean. It's buried in confessions, childhood scars, and a courtroom moment no one saw coming. And once you hear it, the entire case becomes even harder to understand. On an ordinary night in Lake Conroe, the kind of place where people leave porch lights glowing and never expect danger, everything changed in a matter of hours. Three innocent people, a mother, her teenage son, and his best friend, went from living their normal routines to becoming the center of one of Texas's most disturbing murder cases. And the reason behind it didn't come from some carefully planned heist or deep-rooted hatred. It came from two teenagers who decided they were tired of walking and wanted nicer cars. What happened next shattered the illusion of safety this quiet town had built for decades. Neighbors woke up to flashing patrol cars, detectives scrambling across two crime scenes, and a mystery that didn't make sense to anyone. How could something as simple as wanting a ride turn into a trail of violence that felt almost unreal? But this was only the beginning, because as investigators started piecing together the timeline, they quickly realized the truth was far more twisted than anyone expected. Long before the murders, Michael Perry and Jason Burkett were already drifting toward disaster. Michael grew up in a loving adoptive home, but his mind never seemed to settle. Doctors labeled him with every disorder they could name, and each year the chaos only deepened. He stole from his own family, wrecked property for the thrill of it, and bounced through treatment centers that couldn't slow him down. By the time he turned 18, he walked away from the last program meant to help him and sank into homelessness, addiction, and survival choices that pushed him even further into the dark. Jason's life was different, but just as destructive. While Michael battled his own mind, Jason grew up in a house ruled by violence. His parents weren't just neglectful, they were dangerous. His father beat his mother, shot her with pellets, and even worse, leaving Jason to watch it all before he was old enough to understand what any of it meant. That kind of trauma doesn't leave quietly. It twists everything. Even then, Jason still saw the man hurting him as some kind of hero. When Michael and Jason crossed paths, it wasn't friendship, it was fuel meeting fire. Two teenagers carrying years of pain, anger, and desperation. Two minds already wired for bad decisions. And once they bonded over drugs, resentment, and the fantasy of living a life richer than the one they'd been handed, it was only a matter of time before their thoughts turned into something far more dangerous. Neither of them knew it, but they were already speeding toward a night that would destroy three families, and their own futures, with no chance of turning back. For all the chaos that would follow, the plan itself couldn't have been more simple. Michael and Jason wanted better cars, and they believed Sandra Stotler's home was the perfect place to get them. No violence, no confrontation, just slip in after everyone was asleep, grab the keys, and disappear before morning. In their minds, it was practically harmless. Insurance would cover the loss, the family would be annoyed, and they would be gone with a Camaro and an SUV that made them feel like they finally belonged in a world they'd always envied. But everything changed the second Sandra answered her door. She recognized Michael, he'd been friendly with her son, and she didn't think twice about speaking with him. Then she mentioned one detail neither teenager expected: Adam wouldn't be home for 2 more hours. That single sentence cracked their plan in half. They had no excuse to linger, no way to wait around without raising suspicion, and no idea how to retreat without looking guilty. So they left, driving away from the house that held everything they wanted. Somewhere between the driveway and the end of the street, desperation drowned out logic. They'd seen the Camaro, they'd seen the rodeo, and they couldn't walk away. So instead of abandoning the plan, they twisted it. They parked down the road, slipped back toward the house, and stepped over a line they couldn't erase. Jason approached the front door to keep Sandra distracted. Michael slipped inside through the garage with a shotgun in his hands. At that moment, the plan was no longer about stealing cars. It had already become a countdown to the violence Sandra had no idea was closing in on her. Inside Sandra's quiet home, Michael waited in the laundry room with the shotgun, listening to the footsteps of a woman who had no idea her life was already slipping away. When he knocked on the back door from inside the house, Sandra walked over expecting something ordinary, a noise, a draft, maybe her son returning early. Instead, she stepped straight into the path of a teenager who had already convinced himself that violence was the only way forward. The first blast hit her before she could even process what she was seeing. Even wounded, she tried to stand, refusing to go down without a fight. The second shot ended any chance she had. A nurse who spent her life saving strangers was now lying on her own floor, dying alone in the place she thought was safest. Michael and Jason wrapped her body in sheets from her own home and treated her like cargo, loading her into the truck without hesitation. They drove to Crater Lake and rolled her into the water, watching the darkness swallow her without a word. But the night wasn't over. Michael still needed the Camaro keys, and they weren't in the house. Killing Sandra meant nothing if he couldn't take the car he'd come for. So they made a new decision, one even colder than the first. They would return for Adam, and if he was with anyone, that person would die too. Hours later, Adam and his best friend Jeremy pulled up to the Bentwater gate, unaware that two killers were waiting for them in the dark. Michael and Jason flagged them down with a story no good kid would ignore. A friend had accidentally shot himself in the woods and needed help. Jeremy and Adam didn't hesitate. They followed, worried about a stranger they believed was bleeding somewhere in the trees. Kristen, sitting in the truck, watched them walk toward their own deaths. In the woods, the lie shattered instantly. Jason shot Jeremy first, no warning, no chance to react. One moment Jeremy was stepping forward to help someone, the next he was collapsing to the ground, his life ending before he understood what was happening. Jason then walked back to Adam, pretending nothing was wrong. "Did you hear those gunshots?" he asked, luring him deeper into the trees. Adam followed, still hoping his friend was alive. That hope lasted only seconds. Jason raised the gun and shot him 3 times, leaving the 16-year-old beside the boy who called him a brother. When the woods fell silent, Michael stepped forward, not to help, but to search Adam's pockets. He took his wallet. He took the car keys. Then he walked away from the bodies as if they were nothing more than obstacles to the life he wanted. That same night, instead of hiding or panicking, the 2 teenagers went to a nightclub. 3 people were dead. Their killers were celebrating. For 2 days, Michael Perry acted like nothing had happened. He drove Sandra's red Camaro around town as if it were his own, showing it off without a hint of fear. But his arrogance caught up with him when a police officer noticed a traffic violation and tried to pull him over. Instead of stopping, Michael panicked and sped off, leading police on a reckless chase that ended with him crashing the car and trying to run on foot. When officers searched him, they found Adam's wallet in his pocket, yet Michael had the nerve to give them Adam's name when they arrested him. He was booked under the identity of one of his victims and walked out after posting bail, thinking he'd fooled everyone. The very next day, everything unraveled. Sandra's body surfaced in Crater Lake, turning a missing person case into a full-scale homicide investigation. Detectives immediately started searching for Adam and his SUV, unaware that the boy they were trying to save was already lying in the woods, and that the man who had impersonated him had already slipped through their hands. Michael's mask cracked on October 29. He showed up at Jason's girlfriend's house with a loaded shotgun, threatening her and admitting he'd already killed someone. She didn't call the police right away, but his desperation made it clear he knew the walls were closing in. The final break came on October 30, when deputies spotted the stolen rodeo at a truck stop. Michael and Jason were inside. They tried one last escape, ramming a deputy with the vehicle and crashing into a nearby store before attempting to flee on foot. It didn't work. They were caught within seconds. At the station, detectives read Michael his rights and expected a battle. What they got was a confession so detailed it stunned even seasoned investigators. He described hiding in the laundry room, pulling the trigger on Sandra, loading her body into the truck, luring Adam and Jeremy into the woods, watching Jason shoot them, and celebrating at a nightclub afterward. His words matched the evidence perfectly. DNA linked him to the scene. The stolen cars and belongings tied everything together. And the details in his confession were things only the killer could know. But the twist came fast. As soon as the reality of what he had admitted sank in, Michael changed his story. Suddenly, the detectives had forced him to confess. Suddenly, he claimed Jason was the mastermind behind everything. Suddenly, he was the victim. The problem was simple. The evidence didn't agree with him. His DNA was where it shouldn't have been. Witnesses placed him with the stolen cars. Kristen was ready to testify about the night she watched them lure two boys into the woods. And his own recorded confession, calm, clear, and specific, told the truth that he now wanted to run from. What Michael didn't realize was that the next twist wouldn't come from him. It would come from a courtroom, one that would decide two killers should face two very different punishments. When the trials began, prosecutors made one thing clear: both teenagers were guilty of the same nightmare. But to keep the cases clean and avoid confusion for the juries, they tried each killer for a different murder. Michael Perry for Sandra's death, and Jason Burkett for Jeremy's. Both cases carried the same possible ending, the death penalty. Michael's trial came first, and the evidence against him landed like a hammer. Jurors listened to his recorded confession, hearing the calm way he described shooting Sandra inside her own home and watching her body sink into Crater Lake. They saw the DNA results placing him at the scene. They saw the stolen items he carried. And they watched a young man who never showed genuine remorse. It took the jury just 2 hours to convict him of capital murder. The sentencing phase lasted longer, but the outcome didn't change. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury handed down the harshest punishment Texas had to offer: death. Jason's trial began 8 months later, and on the surface, it looked just as damning. He had executed both teenage boys in the woods. He had helped dump Sandra's body. He had celebrated afterward. The jury convicted him quickly. But when his sentencing phase began, something unexpected happened, something that would save his life. His defense team didn't argue innocence. They focused on Jason's past, calling psychologists and family members who described a childhood built on trauma. They talked about the brain damage from prenatal drug exposure, the years of violent beatings, and the moments that shaped him long before he met Michael. Then came the turning point. Jason's father, Delbert, entered the courtroom from prison, where he was serving time for abusing children. He stood in front of the jury, a man who had destroyed his own family, and begged them not to destroy his son as well. Through tears, he admitted what he had done to Jason's mother, to his children, and to the life Jason never had a chance to build. The room went silent. Even Jason, who had shown almost no emotion throughout the trial, broke down when he heard his father finally accept responsibility. That moment shattered the certainty in the room. The jury deliberated for hours, torn between the horror of Jason's crime and the horror of the life he'd survived. In the end, they chose mercy by the slimmest margin possible. By just 2 votes, Jason Burkett received life in prison instead of death. 2 killers, 1 crime, 2 entirely different sentences. And the divide came down to one courtroom moment, one father's admission, that jurors simply could not ignore. While Jason settled into a life sentence, Michael Perry was sent to the Huntsville Unit, Texas's death row, where days feel like years and every appeal is a countdown. Most inmates eventually face what they've done, finding religion or remorse as the execution date creeps closer. Michael never did. He spent nearly 9 years insisting he'd been framed, claiming his confession was forced, and refusing to admit any role in the murders. His lawyers tried everything: procedural arguments, new interpretations of old evidence, even attempts to attack the credibility of witnesses. One by one, every appeal fell apart. The courts were unmoved. His confession remained solid. The DNA remained solid. The timeline remained solid, and the date of his execution kept inching closer. What made the wait even harder was what happened outside the prison walls. Just weeks before Michael was scheduled to die, his adoptive father passed away, a final blow to a family that had spent years trying to save a boy who didn't want to be saved. Even then, Michael wouldn't let go of the story he'd built around himself. He wasn't the killer. He was the victim. On July 1, 2010, Michael Perry was escorted into the Huntsville death chamber, a place where hundreds had taken their last breath before him. Behind the glass, the families of his victims watched in silence. His adoptive mother stood among them, devastated but still present for the son she had fought for until the end. As the lethal injection began, Michael gave a final statement that stunned the room. Instead of acknowledging the lives he'd taken, he spoke as though he were the one being wronged. He offered forgiveness to the families of the people he'd killed, calling his own execution a crime. Even in his last moments, he shifted blame away from himself. When he looked toward his mother, his voice broke. "Mom, I love you," he said softly. Then he mentioned his father, saying, "I'm going home to my dad," as a single tear slid down his cheek. Minutes later, his breathing slowed. At 6:17 p.m., Michael James Perry was pronounced dead at 28 years old. Jason Burkett, the partner who walked the same path but received a different judgment, remains in a Texas prison today. He won't be eligible for parole until 2041, when he'll be nearly 60. The families of Sandra Stotler, Adam Stotler, and Jeremy Richardson continue living with a loss that time can't repair. 3 innocent lives were taken, 2 teenagers were punished in 2 very different ways, and all of it began with something as small and senseless as wanting nicer cars. This case doesn't sit easily in anyone's mind. 2 teenagers, 2 killers, 3 victims, and yet, only 1 death. Michael Perry paid with his life, while Jason Burkett remains locked away, his sentence a constant reminder that justice can be both absolute and inexplicable. People debate it endlessly. Was the system fair, or did a father's tears decide a boy's fate more than the law itself ever could? What's undeniable is the ripple effect of that night. Families shattered, lives stolen, and a quiet Texas town forever haunted by the memory of ordinary kids who went to help a friend and never came back. It raises a question that lingers long after the headlines fade. When human lives collide with broken systems, pain, and chance, how do we truly decide who lives and who dies? For some, the answer is justice. For others, it's mercy. And for everyone else, it's a story that refuses to leave your mind, because sometimes, the most shocking crimes aren't just the ones committed, but the ones that leave the world asking, why this way?